I left town for exactly 48 hours, just 2 days, to watch my daughter get married, walk her down the aisle, do the whole emotional dad thing where you pretend you're holding it together while quietly falling apart inside. And when I came back, my backyard looked like someone had dropped a bomb on it. I'm not exaggerating. The ground was torn up, there were tire tracks cutting across the lawn like scars, and where 3 massive oak trees had stood for over a century, there were just stumps. Raw, jagged, bleeding sap into the dirt like something had been killed there, because something had. And the silence? That was the worst part. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just empty. I stood there for a good minute, maybe longer, trying to convince myself I was looking at the wrong property, that somehow I'd walked into the wrong yard. But no. That broken stone bench, that old fence line, that was mine. Those trees were mine. Now here's the thing about those oaks. They weren't just landscaping. They were history. Planted sometime in the 1890s, long before any of these modern glass boxes showed up, long before the neighborhood got rebranded as some luxury hillside enclave. Those trees were older than every house on that street combined. They were protected, documented, studied. Hell, my aunt used to bring her grad students out there to talk about urban ecosystems. And someone had just erased them. I didn't need long to figure out who. Because right over the fence, perfectly framed where those trees used to block the view, was my neighbor's brand new infinity pool, shimmering like a smug little mirror under the afternoon sun. And there she was, Reagan Hale, plastic surgeon, influencer, self-proclaimed architectural visionary, currently stretched out on a lounge chair like she was in a perfume commercial, sunglasses on, sipping something expensive and unnecessary. She didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't even look concerned. She just tilted her head slightly, like she'd been expecting this moment. So I walked over, slow, deliberate, the kind of walk where you're trying very hard not to explode, and I said, "What happened to my trees?" And she smiled. Not apologetic, not nervous, just amused. "Oh, those," she said, waving her hand like she was brushing off crumbs. "They were a hazard." A hazard. I actually laughed, like a short, broken kind of laugh that didn't feel like it belonged to me. "A hazard." She said, sitting up now, like she was about to explain something obvious to a child. "They were diseased, structurally unstable, casting excessive shade. My contractor said they were a liability. Honestly, I did you a favor." A favor? Right. Now, rewind a few months, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Reagan had been circling the issue for a while. Little comments here and there, always dressed up as concern, always delivered with that same polished, almost clinical tone. "Your trees block the valley view," she'd say. "Or have you considered trimming them back?" And then eventually, "I know a specialist who could manage them properly." Manage, meaning butcher. I said no. Every single time. Politely at first, then more firmly, then finally with that tone people use when they're done negotiating. Those trees weren't getting touched. But Reagan wasn't used to hearing no. You could tell just by looking at her house, if you could even call it that. It was this massive glass and steel structure dropped right into the middle of a historic neighborhood like it had been delivered by mistake. Clean lines, imported stone, rooftop deck. The kind of place that screams, "I don't care what was here before me." She'd already torn down a 1920s Tudor to build it, fought zoning restrictions the whole way, and somehow, always won. Permits appeared. Exceptions were granted. Rules bent just enough to let her through. So when I saw those stumps, I knew exactly what had happened. "You went onto my property," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and had protected trees removed while I was out of town." She shrugged. Actually shrugged. "Well," she said, "my arborist filed an emergency report. They were classified as dangerous. Once that happens, removal is authorized." Authorized? That word again. "You're telling me," I said, "that 3 healthy, century-old oaks suddenly became an emergency the weekend I left town?" She smiled again, a little tighter this time. "Nature doesn't schedule itself around your calendar." And there it was, that little flicker of something underneath the polish. Not just entitlement, but irritation. Because to her, this wasn't about trees. It was about control. About the fact that there was one thing she couldn't redesign, reframe, or remove, and it bothered her. Those trees blocked her perfect view. They interfered with the image she was trying to build. And instead of accepting that, she erased the obstacle. I looked past her. out toward the valley that was now fully visible from her pool, and I realized something else. She'd planned this. Not impulsive, not emotional, planned. The timing, the paperwork, the contractor, all lined up perfectly for the one weekend I was gone. "You think this is over?" I asked. She leaned back into her chair, completely unbothered. "I think," she said slowly, "that you're upset, which is understandable, but everything was done legally. You can check with the city if you'd like." "Oh, I was going to check." I went inside, grabbed every document I had on the property, old surveys, conservation notes, anything my aunt had left behind, and I started making calls. City forestry, zoning, anyone who would pick up. And here's where it got interesting, because Reagan wasn't lying. Not exactly. There was an emergency permit on file, filed 2 days earlier, approved fast-tracked, backed by a certified arborist report claiming structural instability and disease. On paper, it looked clean, too clean, which meant one of two things. Either those trees had magically deteriorated overnight, or someone had found a way to game the system. And standing there, staring out at those stumps again, I had this slow, sinking realization. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. This was something bigger. Because those trees weren't just protected by local guidelines, they were part of something else. Something older. Something buried in paperwork most people forgot existed. And if I was right, Reagan hadn't just crossed a line. She'd stepped into territory where the rules were very, very different. All right, pause the story for a second, because this is where things get interesting, and honestly, where most people get it completely wrong. From a legal perspective, what Reagan did looks airtight on the surface. She filed an emergency tree removal, got an arborist to sign off, pushed it through fast-track approval. That's actually a known workaround in a lot of cities. According to standard procedure, if a tree is deemed an immediate hazard, you don't need the usual layers of review. You act first, justify later. And yeah, people abuse that all the time. But here's the catch, and this is where she messed up. Local permits only protect you locally. They don't override state or federal protections, especially when environmental designations are involved. If those trees were part of a protected habitat or tied to conservation easements, then that emergency permit becomes basically meaningless outside city limits. Now, psychologically, this is a classic control play. This is a psychological trap people like Reagan fall into. They mistake influence for immunity. She'd pushed boundaries before, gotten away with bending rules, so in her mind, the system was flexible, negotiable, optional. But systems like environmental law, those aren't flexible. They're quiet, slow, and then suddenly very, very loud. And the moment I realized that, I knew exactly where to look next. So that night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of old folders my aunt had left behind. Yellowed papers, handwritten notes, maps that looked like they'd been photocopied 100 times, the kind of stuff most people would have thrown out years ago. But my aunt, she didn't keep things without a reason. She was a botanist, obsessive in the way only people who truly love something can be. And back in the 70s, she'd been part of a project to classify sections of our hillside as protected urban forest. At the time, it probably felt like paperwork, academic stuff, nothing dramatic. But as I flipped through those pages, something started to click. There were references to habitat corridors, nesting patterns, species lists, and then I saw it. A conservation easement. Not just a local designation. This was tied into broader environmental protections. Federal-level stuff. The kind that doesn't disappear just because someone files a convenient, emergency form with the city. And suddenly, Reagan's little paperwork trick didn't look so clever anymore. I got up, grabbed my laptop, and started digging deeper. Cross-referencing property records, environmental databases, anything I could access without needing a law degree. And the more I looked, the worse it got for her. Those 3 oaks, they weren't just trees. They were part of a microhabitat that supported at least 2 species listed under protected status. Nothing flashy, not wolves or eagles, but small, overlooked creatures that environmental law takes very seriously. Birds that nested only in mature oak canopies. Insects that depended on that specific ecosystem. Remove the trees, you don't just change the view. You destroy the system. And here's the thing. Once federal protection enters the picture, everything changes. It's not about neighbor disputes anymore. It's not about permits or property lines. It becomes enforcement. By sunrise, I had a plan. I went back outside, took photos, everything. Close-ups of the stumps, the exposed root systems, the disturbed soil where nesting sites had clearly been torn apart. I documented angles, distances, timestamps, not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I knew how this worked. If you're going to step into federal territory, you better come prepared. Then I started making calls. Not the city this time. I was done with city. I reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Left a detailed report. Then the EPA. Then the State Conservation Office. Each time, same approach. Calm, factual, documented. No yelling, no accusations, just information. Because that's how you get taken seriously. And then, I waited. Reagan, meanwhile, carried on like nothing had happened. Over the next couple days, I watched her host people by that pool, laughing, drinking, showing off that now unobstructed view like she'd just upgraded her life. Contractors came and went, finishing up landscaping, installing lighting, polishing stone. It was like watching someone decorate a stage, not realizing the building underneath it had already been flagged for demolition. Monday morning, everything changed. It started with one vehicle. Government issued, unmarked but obvious if you know what to look for. Then another. Then a third. By noon, there were people all over her property. Clipboards, cameras, equipment. Not contractors, investigators. Biologists. The kind of quiet professionals who don't need to raise their voices because the authority is already there. I stayed on my side of the fence, didn't interfere, just watched. Reagan came out eventually, sunglasses on like always. But this time, there was something different in her posture. Tension. Confusion. She walked over to one of the agents, clearly expecting this to be some kind of misunderstanding she could smooth over with the right tone, the right explanation. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough. I have permits, she said, holding up a folder. Everything was approved through the city. The agent didn't even look at it right away, just nodded once, then said something short, measured, and whatever he said, it landed. You could see it. That tiny shift in her expression, the moment confidence turns into uncertainty. Because again, city approval doesn't mean anything at that level. Over the next few hours, they surveyed everything. Not just the missing trees, the entire property. Soil disruption, drainage changes, imported landscaping, the excavation for that infinity pool. Every alteration she'd made over the past 2 years got pulled into the investigation. Because once you trigger a federal environmental review, they don't look at one action. They look at the system. And Reagan's entire property? It wasn't a system anymore. It was damage. By late afternoon, they posted notices. Official ones. The kind printed on heavy paper, sealed, documented. And even from a distance, I could tell, this wasn't a warning. This was enforcement. A couple days later, the results came in. The EPA classified the tree removal as destruction of protected habitat. Not potential damage, actual damage. Confirmed. Documented. And because those trees were part of a larger ecosystem under conservation protection, the violation extended beyond just their removal. It included everything connected to them, which meant the pool, the hardscaping, the imported plants she'd brought in to create that resort aesthetic. All of it had contributed to disrupting a protected environment. And then came the part that, honestly, even I didn't expect to hit that hard. They ordered full restoration. Not partial, not symbolic. Full. The pool had to go. Completely removed. Excavation reversed. Native soil profiles restored. Every non-native plant stripped out and replaced with species appropriate to the original ecosystem. And not just replanted randomly, done under supervision, with ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance. On top of that, a $200,000 fine. And then the real kicker, her property was placed under permanent conservation oversight. Which sounds technical, but what it really means is nothing she does with that land will ever be simple again. Every change, every modification, every improvement, reviewed, approved, documented, forever. I saw her a few days after that. No pool party this time. No music, no guests. Just her standing out there, staring at the water like she was trying to figure out how something that had felt so permanent could suddenly be temporary. She noticed me, of course. Walked over, slower this time. No sunglasses. No performance. This is insane, she said, voice tight. They're overreacting. I didn't say anything at first. Just looked past her, at what used to be my trees, and then back at her. You cut down protected habitat, I said. What did you think was going to happen? I had permits, she repeated, but now it sounded different. Not confident, defensive, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. And that's when it hit her, or at least, I think it did, because she stopped talking, just stood there for a second, processing. And in that silence, you could almost hear the realization settling in. This wasn't something she could fix with a phone call. Over the next few months, everything unraveled exactly the way you'd expect. Contractors came back, not to build, but to undo. The pool was drained, dismantled, ripped out piece by piece. The sleek stonework she'd been so proud of got hauled away like debris. The landscaping? Gone. Replaced with young native plants that looked fragile, unfinished. Like the land was trying to remember what it used to be. And the oversight didn't stop. Inspectors came regularly, checking progress, documenting compliance. It turned her property into something else entirely. Not a luxury home, but a project, a responsibility, a restriction. Meanwhile, on my side of the fence, things were different. Federal restoration funds kicked in, because while my trees were gone, the damage hadn't been my doing. They brought in specialists, soil experts, conservation planners. New trees were planted, not replacements. Not really. You can't replace 100 years overnight. But they were chosen carefully, designated as heritage growth, protected from day one. And here's the ironic part, those protections? They increased my property value significantly, because now my land wasn't just residential, it was recognized, preserved, part of something bigger. Reagan's place, on the other hand, became almost impossible to sell. Turns out buyers don't love the idea of permanent federal oversight, or ongoing restoration costs, or the possibility that any future project could trigger another investigation. What used to be a dream home listing turned into a liability, a complicated one. About 6 months later, she sold. Quietly. No big listing campaign, no open houses. Just gone. Sold at a loss big enough that even someone in her tax bracket would feel it. And last I heard, she moved into a downtown penthouse, somewhere with no trees, no soil, nothing that could get her into trouble. And those 3 oaks? They're still gone. Nothing changes that. But what replaced them wasn't just new growth. It was something stronger. Boundaries that couldn't be ignored. Rules that couldn't be bent. She wanted a better view. What she got was a very expensive lesson in how much a view can cost. So yeah, that's how it ended. Or at least, that's how her version of it ended. Mine's still going, just quieter now. The new trees are growing, slowly, stubbornly. The way things that actually matter tend to grow. And every now and then I'll stand out there with a cup of coffee, looking at those saplings, and I'll think about how close all of this came to just being another story where someone with enough money and confidence rewrites the rules. Because that's usually how these things go, right? Power pushes, systems bend, and everyone else just adapts. But not this time. And that's really the point of this whole story. Not the revenge, not the fine, not even the pool getting ripped out piece by piece like some kind of slow-motion reality check. The real story is about something a lot of people don't fully understand until it's too late. The difference between what you can do and what you're actually allowed to do. Because according to standard procedure, yeah, Reagan did everything right. She filed paperwork, hired professionals, got approvals. On the surface, it checked all the boxes. And that's exactly why it worked, at first. That's how these situations trap people. They follow the visible rules and assume that's the whole system. But it's not. From a legal perspective, property ownership in the U.S. has layers. You own the land, sure, but that ownership sits inside a framework of local ordinances, HOA rules if you have them, state regulations, and then federal law sitting at the top, like the final authority. And those layers don't always talk to each other in real time. So you can get approval at one level and still be completely exposed at another. And that's what happened here. She optimized for speed and control. She used a legal shortcut that works in a lot of situations. But she didn't ask the deeper question, what else governs this land? Not what's convenient, not what's fast, but what's actually binding. And honestly, that's not just a legal mistake. This is a psychological trap. People who are used to winning, whether it's in business, medicine, real estate, whatever, they start to internalize a certain pattern. They push boundaries, they get results, and over time, they stop seeing limits as fixed. Everything becomes negotiable. Regulations become obstacles to navigate, not structures to respect. And most of the time, that mindset works. It gets rewarded until it doesn't. Because systems like environmental law, conservation protections, federal oversight, those aren't reactive in the same way. They don't argue. They don't negotiate. They don't care how confident you sound or how expensive your lawyer is. They just sit there, quiet, in the background. And the moment you cross into their territory, they activate. Fully. No warning shot. And the lesson here is, if you only understand the rules that are convenient to you, you don't actually understand the rules. You're just operating inside a bubble that hasn't been tested yet. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, okay, but I'd never do something like that, maybe. But it's not always that obvious. It's not always someone bulldozing trees for a better pool view. Sometimes it's smaller. Renovations, landscaping, adding structures, even cutting down a single tree. You assume because it's on your property, it's your decision. And a lot of the time, that's true. But not always. There are easements people forget about. Protected zones buried in old records. HOA rules that seem minor until they're enforced. State regulations that only come into play under specific conditions. And federal protections that, honestly, most homeowners don't even realize exist until they're already in violation. So what do you do with that? You slow down. You ask more questions than you think you need to. You don't just rely on one approval. You understand the layers behind it. You look at the history of your property, not just its current listing. And if something feels off, if a shortcut seems a little too easy, a little too fast, you stop and dig deeper. Because shortcuts in regulated systems, they almost always lead somewhere expensive. And on the human side of this, maybe the bigger takeaway is about boundaries. Not legal ones, personal ones. Reagan didn't just ignore the law. She ignored a very clear boundary I set, multiple times. And instead of accepting that, she found a way around it. That's not ambition. That's entitlement. And entitlement has a way of escalating. Because once you justify crossing one line, the next one feels smaller. And the next one after that, even smaller. Until eventually, you cross a line that actually matters. And by then, it's too late to step back. So yeah, 3 trees. That's where this started. 3 trees that were inconvenient, in the way, blocking a perfect view. And if she had just accepted that, just lived with it, none of this would have happened. She'd still have her pool, her house, her control over that space. Instead, she tried to force reality to match her expectations. And reality pushed back. Hard. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have gone through all that? Filed the reports, pulled the records, escalated it to that level? Or would you have just taken the loss and moved on? Because honestly, there was a moment, right at the beginning, where that would have been easier. Anyway, let me know in the comments.